Right. Hello everybody, thank you for joining us again. Now this week we are looking at the context of Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. As you know, we've done Macbeth's context, and it's really important that both of us think that we start with context for any text, as I've explained in the previous video. So let's get straight to it.
Yes.
Now, Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, he didn't make up the story, so that's the first thing that we need to know. A guy, a poet, English, called Arthur Brooks. So it's important to know this because Shakespeare actually just simply added to the original story, which had been around, and English people would have known about the story. It was originally called Romeus and Juliet, and it had been around the English-speaking language for about 100 years.
What you need to remember is that the original poem was quite long-winded and drawn out. So the great thing about a Romeo and Juliet is that Shakespeare packs it full of action. He puts it into 4 days. Okay, and he makes it something that's a box office hit, basically.
Yeah, so originally the story would have taken about 9 months to play out, but Shakespeare condenses it into 4 days. So he increases the pace to make it full of action. So exactly like a blockbuster hit. So we're going to see something, with explosions and so on and so forth. So that's how we could relate to that. So one thing that he did add, though, however, Shakespeare mustn't be criticised for taking already written stories, because he did add huge value to them. And one character that he wrote himself and into the play was Mercutio. And as we know, Mercutio is probably one of the most outstanding characters within the play.
A very interesting character. In fact, he was so popular that some people say that's why Shakespeare kills him off early, because he detracts from the lovers and the idea of the feud and fate and so on. What's also interesting is none of the characters that were in the original poem are as complex as Shakespeare makes them. So in the poem, they were very stereotyped. So a stereotyped friar and a nurse who was a bit bawdy and a bit coarse. And even though Shakespeare uses some of this in his development of these characters, he makes them so much more complex, which is why we always ask ourselves who's to blame, who's really to blame in the end, because we've got these interesting characters like Friar Lawrence and the nurse. Even though we've got the main characters, Romeo and Juliet, these other characters are very important in terms of the plot and the structure and the action and the tragedy, and of course Mercutio.
Exactly. I mean, Shakespeare, again, as we know, he didn't create anything by mistake, and we always have to ask ourselves, to get those high grades in GCSE, you've got your PEE, and then to really get that level 8, that level 9, you start positing questions, you put forward questions. What was the message Shakespeare was trying to portray with such and such a character, or with this line of the story, for example? Now, going back to other influences that Shakespeare used, and it's very important to know these. So first one was Arthur Brooks. Now the second influence that Shakespeare used was a Roman poet called Ovid, O-V-I-D, Ovid. Now Ovid had written lots and lots of Italian poetry. Yes, Italian, Roman. And one of those plays was called Pyramus and Thisbe. Now some of you may have read Midsummer Night's Dream when you were in primary school. That seems to be the feedback. And Pyramus and Thisbe, the play, slots into A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it's a comedy. But originally it wasn't, by Ovid, and Shakespeare uses that as an influence as well. It's a love story.
In fact, you can see a lot of stuff coming from Midsummer Night's Dream. You've also got the father who won't allow his daughter to marry the person that she loves. So you've got some of these themes of patriarchy especially creeping through, which probably brings us to the role of women in Romeo and Juliet.
So, of course, what do we have? We have, again, patriarchy. So these are universal themes that were prevalent around Elizabethan times. And so, of course, Shakespeare's going to talk about them. And they're still prevalent now, actually, which is why we still read the plays. So we have the character of Juliet. Now, she is indeed only around 13, 14, but was normal at that age to be married.
I think some of the original stories, she was 16. So you've got to ask yourself, well, why is Shakespeare making her 13? It could be because they thought that Italians were very strange, and
don't get me started on the old sexuality of the Italians.
That the Italians were vengeful and secretive, and of course it was all this suspicion because they didn't really know what was going on, but they heard lots of stories coming back from all these warring factions in Italy, and these interesting families. And of course, about these very young women that were married off and bartered.
But it wasn't that dissimilar to England. I mean,
it was happening in England as well.
So it was quite a kind of understood concept that a young girl was going to be traded to a man by her father. And of course, that's what we've got with Capulet, trading his daughter to marry Paris so that they could actually sort of move up in the world. So a woman was a chattel. That's a good piece of vocabulary to have, chattel, Chattel, which means basically something that you own and that you barter with. So bargaining, like I'll give you 6 chickens if you give me your daughter.
Yes,
You
were owned by your father. And when he passed you on to your husband, you became your husband's property.
So to an audience, let's go back to the fact that we have to keep talking in our answers in our GCSE that there is an audience there, it is a play. An Elizabethan audience would have been very understanding and very shocked that a young girl flouted, refused to marry the man her father was basically bartering with and selling her onto. So they would have been very, very shocked by this. And for Juliet to then go and marry in secret, for that audience, it would have been far more shocking than it is for us today. Also, this moves on to why he's setting it in Italy. Shakespeare sets 7 of his plays in Italy. Why did he do this?
Well, I think there was a fascination with Italy and Italian culture, and also you could be slightly critical of Catholicism because Italy was a Catholic country, and of course the history with Protestantism and the England removing itself from Rome and all the suspicions of the priests and the Roman Catholic Church. Italy was still very highly influenced by the Catholic Church and the Pope and Catholicism. So setting it in Verona and in Italy meant that he could make some interesting comments about violence and a young woman maybe being married off, even if most of his society agreed with it.
He could continuously sort of poke at issues that were prevalent in Elizabethan England without it being obvious because his setting was essentially a foreign country.
Exactly.
So it looked like he was poking fun at a foreign country. Now also the Renaissance was happening. So Renaissance, the birth of painting's beauty was very much something that started in Italy. And even though Shakespeare and many English people hadn't been to Italy, what they'd heard about it was that it was this culture of romance and love and passion and violence and death. But it was all very, very sort of entertaining and beautiful and mystical. So he was able to have more license in his writing and character representations by setting the play in Italy, which at the time was a fascinating culture to the English people.
Quite fashionable probably as well. And also 100 years before Shakespeare, you have the poet, Petrarch, where you get the Petrarchan sonnet from.
Right.
So that's quite key because I think Shakespeare's kind of mocking Petrarch.
This is really important to know, everybody. So you will have heard of a sonnet, and everyone thinks Shakespeare invented the sonnet. Well, no, he didn't. Petrarch, Petrarch, Petrarch. So you've got a Petrarchan sonnet and a Shakespearean sonnet. Now, Shakespeare took what was a poem about love, a sonnet, 14 lines, from Petrarch, and he uses the style of that in a lot of Romeo's language at the beginning of the play when Romeo is talking about Rosaline. Now, it's ridiculous and it sounds funny when he's using it, but it's deliberate. He's making fun, he's poking fun at Petrarch, who would have perhaps watched or certainly heard about this play. So when Romeo's talking about Rosaline, what is he doing? It's sort of, he's talking in a sort of comedic, silly way, so Mercutio and Benvolio are laughing at him.
Yeah, they think it's hilarious. And he's also mocking courtly behaviour in these wealthy families. A man had to show almost exaggerated courtship rituals, and so did women really. And there was this whole ritual that went about when you had to win over your woman that you wanted. And of course, she'd play hard to get, and you'd have this momentary unrequited love, and then suddenly she's married and shackled.
And of course, we're blowing all of this out of the water in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Also too, another influence from Italy, another reason why he set it in Italy, was another influence at the time was duelling. And this had become very popular in England, originating in Renaissance Italy. duelling was a way in Italy to settle disputes between men. Shakespeare thought this was an absolutely ludicrous idea, which I agree with him. And so when he depicts the duelling of Tybalt and Romeo and Tybalt and Mercutio, and of course both result in death, is he indeed making a comment that this new epidemic of a way to solve disputes is absolutely ridiculous? So that's something to bear in mind as well. He also borrows poison, the idea of poison. In Italy, poisoning people was a very popular way of assassination. Now, interestingly, not only does he use this element from Italy, borrows this, he actually gives the poison to a priest to deliver. And of course, this goes back to our Catholicism, as you were talking about before. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I think so. But obviously, it's not poison that he gives to Juliet. He gives her that potion. But in a way, it's dangerous. And he's meddling with
the laws.
With the laws, he's meddling with her obedience to her father, which should be ultimate. She should have just backed down, married parrots, kept quiet. But she doesn't. And that's also very unusual for a young girl to disobey her parents in such a way and to choose love over obedience.
So again, was Shakespeare commenting, well, look at the Catholics. They're always up to no good. They're always meddling, those Catholics. So perhaps, we're right being a Church of England, a Protestant country. So again, everything that Shakespeare's doing, he is speaking to his audience. He's speaking to the monarch, Elizabeth. He's speaking and sending messages to the noblemen of England, perhaps saying, look at what happens with wealthy families if they don't follow the rules, the prince's rules, as in Romeo and Juliet. If you don't do what the monarch says, it all ends in tragedy.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of commentary on wealthy families themselves and how they behaved, their rituals, their routines, the lavish parties that they held. So you also have class. You have the nurse and her kind of dialect, and then you've got the verse of your more noble characters who speak.
Which Shakespeare does a lot. He sort of does blank verse and prose.
As some people have actually commented and said there's too much going on in Romeo and Juliet, actually. There's a lot going on, lots of characters and different events, but there isn't really a subplot, is there?
No.
He uses subplots in some of his plays, but he doesn't in Romeo
not
and
in
Juliet.
Romeo and
Really,
Juliet.
the focus is on the relationship between Romeo and Juliet, and all the action happens so quickly.
And of course he does like to, as we were saying about the beginning, it is a blockbuster. Again, set in Italy, reasons, because you've got a lot of sexual activity. My favourite part is you keep laughing. It's not because I'm fascinated with it, it's because it's actually true. You've got Juliet, who actually talks about her first night with Romeo quite a lot, about how he looks. The nurse, if we studied the nurse's language...
The nurse loves a rude joke.
And especially as you go on to A-level or university level of studying this, but it's important to know it for GCSE, some of what the nurse says is absolutely filthy, quite frankly.
And it really embarrasses Juliet, who's kind of a bit naive to start with, and then all of a sudden...
Oh, she's not. Well, by the time it ends, I'll tell you that much.
She fancies Romeo a lot.
And so there would have been the in-jokes. So during the Elizabethan audience would be sitting there going, oh my God, but English women wouldn't behave like this, so they think it's okay. They can watch it because English women wouldn't behave like this. And again, that's why Shakespeare sets it in Italy, because it gives him this license to do this. So I think that's really about covering...
I think we've covered most of it. We are going to do a question where we link in some context. So if you're still feeling a little bit confused of how you use context in your exam, please watch that video.
Bye-bye.